actually want to return and become, re-enrolled in the district and receive special education services. They don't have to, but they have to at least be made aware of the option to do that. It's all in the memo, but it's a pretty big deal. It affects not a vast majority of the students in Connecticut that are students with disabilities. However, it does impact about 500 students. When you compare that to the total number of students with disabilities, it doesn't sound like a lot, but 500 is a lot. So just be aware in case it impacts your district as well. That's a memo that went out to directors and superintendents.
So maybe what I could do is highlight these when I send my follow-up email and really bring out these links to highlight them, so it just doesn't get lost in the weeds, because it does sound like these are things that districts really have to, going into the next school year, really look at and pay attention to. So I'll make sure to do that. All right. Thank you, Jane, Kari. I appreciate that. Just to give you guys kind of a heads up on some trainings that are available to you. We are right now in the LEAP 101 virtual training program. It has been really an amazing experience. I've been a part of it along with Kari and along with Anne-Marie and Francisco and Caroline. It really does give a nice overview of really what those home visits look like, really having the conversations around them. So if you haven't had a chance to register yet, or if you already did and maybe you want to just go one more time to refresh your mind, the link is in here for the flyer, which will give you the registration links for the upcoming dates. So I would encourage everybody to maybe look into that and sign up. We also have a welcoming and healthy return to school, ensuring showing up, and this is put on by our Attendance Works partners. The confirmed speakers are listed on the bottom. The date is Wednesday, August 9th. I also included the link for registration onto the slide, so if you're interested in that as well, then I would encourage you as well to sign up for that. Okay, Kari, I will turn this right over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. It's wonderful to see everyone here in July for a summer refresher and basics on chronic absence. As usual, I'm starting with attendance. And these graphs show us year to date. The header's wrong. That should say May 2023. So you'll see here under the subheader, this is May data, and we'll change that before we finalize the deck. That all of our subgroups of students have gone down a little bit this past school year. It was hard work. We are appreciative of everyone's, pulling together your school attendance teams, looking at MTSS strategies and structures to address chronic absence, and really looking at the root causes for absences. But the data is available for you by the school level, district level, by your subgroups in these links here and this QR code. The June data, year to date, the monthly year to date data, and I say that because that's different than the final end of the year data. That data should be up sometime this week or next. But we're really pleased to see the data going in the right direction in all of our subgroups. So keep up the good work. The district should be planning right now for how they're going to reopen school, re-engaging students, engaging them over the summer in those transition years. Kindergarten and 12th grade, kindergarten and 9th grade are still really tough nuts to crack. We're having a hard time getting those kids to come back to school post-pandemic, and there's lots of really good strategies. So stay tuned for Talk Tuesdays, and we're always here to help if you need any assistance. The next slide, please. Just some quick reminders. The June collection is the final time when districts upload their end of the year chronic attendance data. So what the State Department receives is number of days enrolled in the school, and it's called membership, and number of days attended. So we get the number of days they're enrolled and number of days they attended, and then we develop a chronic absence rate for every single student. Right now, districts are reviewing and certifying that data to make sure it's accurate. And this is an opportunity, one-time opportunity to make sure your data is right. And after August 11th, the data freezes, and that is what will be published, and there's no going back. And so I've worked with districts who have been very upset. I think there's a window open, Christine, a little drop down. I've worked with districts who have been very upset that they had a school whose chronic absence rates were really off the charts and that was inaccurate. But right now, the principals, the attendance leads, and the superintendent should be reviewing and certifying the data for accuracy. They have lists, your PSIS coordinators can download students, school, and district data, so you can review that. Very important. So LEAP 101 trainings, as Christine mentioned, are open for all districts. You don't have to be one of the 14 districts that receives a LEAP grant. We have many, many districts across the state and in other states and even in Canada who have been attending our LEAP 101 trainings. They are held once or twice monthly, been hugely popular, and they're just a great way to make sure our home visitors have the knowledge and information and sort of the theory and approach for making those relational home visits that are positive and not punitive. So we're going to drop the link in there, or I dropped the link to the LEAP homepage earlier. I can do that again if we need to. And then on our CSDE contact manager, every district has a district attendance lead. If you could work with your PSIS coordinator to make sure that you have an updated district attendance lead, that's how I send out information to districts, is through that district attendance lead. There's also a list of family engagement leads and school climate, but I use that district attendance lead where the district tells me who is the attendance coordinator for the district. And I think that's it for now. Did I forget anything, Christine or Jay, Caroline? I don't think so.
You're good with your slides. So
okay, I think I'm all set then. I don't want to take up too much time because I know I'm just so excited to have Caroline Calhoun here, a colleague and friend from EdAdvance who works closely with me on LEAP and has been working with districts on professional development and technical assistance around attendance and engagement and setting up system structures and putting a lens of equity on this work. So with that, I'm happy to introduce Caroline Calhoun.
Thank you, Kari. Before I dive in, I think Christine is going to take a moment to do a little informal poll for participants so we can get a handle on sort of how you're feeling about attendance and engagement basics prior to the session beginning and then after the content delivery. So I'm going to turn it over to her for directions on that front, and then we'll dive into the content.
Sounds good. Thank you, Caroline. So what we'd like you to do is we're going to use the chat box for this because it's just the easiest way right now to collect this information. But what level of expertise do you feel in terms of attendance and engagement? And the way to answer this is at a 1, very comfortable, at a 2, comfortable, or at a 3, somewhat comfortable. So what you would do is just put it in the chat. So if you're feeling really good and really comfortable, just add it in. I guess I would do 1 for myself. That might change. Never know. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Great. All right.
Lots of familiar names in the participants here today. So thank you all for taking time out of your summer schedules. We know there are lots of other things you could be doing with your July morning. So we appreciate you being here. And it looks like for everybody adding those numbers to the chat, we have a range of how comfortable people are feeling with this content. Before I get into that content, as Kari mentioned, my name is Caroline Calhoun. I work at EdAdvance, the RESC in the northwestern region of the state up in Litchfield. I actually just left the classroom 2 years ago. My background is in teaching 5th and 6th grade humanities, so integrated language arts and social studies. And when I joined the EdAdvance team, my focus has been a lot on curriculum work, lots of DEI work, and doing attendance work with Kari, and co-coordinating the LEAP program alongside she and Francisco. So really happy to be here with you all. And I really take an approach to all of this with attendance and engagement as, that classroom grounded approach coming from being a teacher for almost 20 years and trying to keep things concrete for folks so that you can come away with this with ideas that you can take back to your classroom, to your building, to whatever role you find yourself in. Next slide, please. So for today's agenda, I want to spend some time just building context for this work and then really thinking about how we create those positive conditions for learning so that students are eager to come to school, and then thinking about how to identify and implement the interventions at our disposal via a multi-tiered system of supports, or MTSS. Next slide, please. So really, before we dive in, I want to think about the big picture in your school. So if you can just think about for a moment and put your answers in the chat, think about what are the root causes of and those reasons for absenteeism in your building or in your district if you're at a district level. Think about what are the barriers to attendance. And lastly, think about, are there any patterns or themes that really stand out to you? And just go ahead and drop those answers in the chat if you would, and everybody can take a peek at those answers. But thinking about what are those root causes, what are you seeing, what are the reasons, what are the barriers, and when you think about those, what are some patterns or themes that stand out? And I'll just drop one in as an example, but if everyone wouldn't mind dropping your thinking in the chat, that would be great. Thank you, Sarah. Lack of access to basic needs. Mental health seems to be a big one. I just saw 3 folks add that to the chat. Substance use, school refusal. Illness, lack of parent engagement, family issues. Families more likely to keep young students home who may not be feeling well. Illness. Post-pandemic anxiety, sensory overload. I see a lot of head nods as I'm looking out across folks on camera. So absolutely, when I guess let's go to the next slide, actually, Christine. So what I want you all to know is that you're not alone. These reasons that everybody just generated off the top of their head, these are the reasons we're seeing statewide. So this list on the left, you see the root causes, reasons, barriers. This is what we tend to hear over and over again from districts that we are working with on attendance and engagement issues. So the main patterns and themes or categories that really seem to emerge are these ones on the right. So these big buckets to do with transportation or medical issues, thinking about socioeconomic factors, parent understanding or the value around attendance and education, thinking about if policies are clear and if there's any sort of misconceptions and misunderstandings. As you mentioned, family matters, obligations that can certainly impact attendance. Discipline, I don't think I saw that actually in the list, but that can definitely play a role, particularly when we talk about secondary students. Students with high needs and staffing shortages are 2 other pieces that we've heard repeatedly from districts. So we do just want you all to know that you're not alone. Your district is not the only one experiencing these sorts of challenges. It really is something that we're seeing statewide. Next slide, please. And thank you, Kari. I saw you added in there engaging curriculum and enrichment. That is definitely another piece to the puzzle. So the next thing I would ask you to do right now is to think about any school or district-wide initiatives that have been put forward by your district's administration in the last few years. And if you could just note 1 or 2 of those initiatives in the chat. So maybe your district is focusing on Marzano's work, maybe you're focusing on the new legislation to do with the science of reading, but just go ahead and drop 1 or 2 initiatives that have been a current focus in your district. And I'll just put an example in there. I know a lot of districts are focusing on SEL, okay, family engagement, relationship building. And these don't have to be to do with attendance, just anything that is an initiative in your district, because we know there are so many different competing priorities and initiatives. That's really what we're trying to get at here. Having teachers make first connection, science of reading. Okay, the Ruler Yale program, great. Curriculum rewrites, yep. Okay, looks like some districts are doing a variety of things to do with attendance, but also different things to do with social emotional health, things to do with science of reading. Really what I want to mention when we think about this in terms of building context for this work is that all of these initiatives are really powerful, right? And they're examples of really important work with powerful potential to make a real and lasting impact for our students. But the reality is that any and all important work and initiatives that you as a district are undertaking, they won't benefit our students if they're not coming to school. So as individuals in your building working on attendance, you have a voice at the table to really dig into making progress when it comes to attendance and engagement. So part of this work is shifting to this all hands on deck approach so that all school community members are really part of the solution. So you need to not only be thinking about and understanding these root causes of absence and thinking through a solutions-oriented lens in terms of interventions and strategies, but also considering the big picture and the whole child. So as we move through today's agenda, I really just want you to think about how you can leverage your building a role in the arena of attendance and how you can take back what you learn here to others in your building. All right, next slide, please. So before we go any further, just a couple nuts and bolts thinking about common language and how we define chronic absenteeism versus how we define truancy and what the difference is. Next slide, please. So thank you to our partners at Attendance Works in California. We do have quite a bit of content that we use routinely from them, and this is one of their slides. So when we think about chronic absence, and I imagine this is a review for most folks on here, but just getting our summer rusty brains back in the groove here. So chronic absence, we think of as missing so much school for any reason that a student is academically at risk. So we define this as missing 10% or more of school, and that's including everything. So those excused absences, unexcused absences, suspensions, et cetera, it all adds up. So really, when I think about it, it's any missed opportunity for learning, whatever the reason may be. Whereas truancy is really only those unexcused absences. Next slide, please. So even more importantly than sort of that definition is thinking about the difference in the mindset when it comes to truancy versus chronic absence. We're really trying to move away from that truancy punitive feel where we're emphasizing compliance with school rules, where there's sort of a more blaming and punitive feel when we think about solutions. This is very different from the chronic absence approach where we're thinking about, okay, how do we emphasize for students and families that the impact of being absent, of having missed days is really something that's important. They're missing that benefit of being present at school. So we want to be using preventative problem-solving trauma-sensitive strategies. And this is where we're really trying to cultivate that family and student engagement, thinking about the whole child, thinking about the whole family. Next slide, please. So Francisco Baires, Kari put his title and name in the chat because I just keep referring to him like he's a celebrity and everybody knows who he is. But he has a lot of background in community organizing. So I always have his voice in my mind when we think about this particular piece of the work, when we think about a mindset shift. So really what we're trying to do in this shift from truancy to chronic absenteeism is to get families to understand that we are here for you. We are an ally in this journey that your child is on from K through 12. So I mentioned that part of the big picture attendance work is shifting to an all hands on deck approach to attendance and engagement. So it really can't just be the job of the principal to worry about attendance or the attendance team members to think about attendance. Instead, it needs to be everybody doing their part so that kids want to come to school, so that they're engaged, so they feel like they belong and are connected and can get to school in spite of any barriers. So similarly, this work requires a mindset shift moving from an old school punitive truancy mindset to instead a very supportive chronic absenteeism model with family engagement at its heart. So when we think about family engagement, we're thinking about viewing families as partners, not as problems. We're thinking about how we work with families, not on them or for them. And there's a big difference, right? So working with them as partners, it's building that relationship that is partnership focused. Next slide, please. So these are all found, these 7 steps or cards, the principles of family engagement. These are all on the CSDE website, but we wanted to highlight these because these principles really are what it's all about. Working with a family is all about cultivating that partnership. It is so important to intentionally connect with people to build toward change together. And this family engagement model provides an opportunity to address patterns of chronic absenteeism and specific barriers to attendance. So these 7 steps sort of outline those principles, but they're also what I think of as the best practices. We want to be modeling those high quality learning practices. We want to be sharing information frequently with our families about how their kids are doing so that we're not only calling when there's a problem. We want to know that we're an ally, and we're also going to call when there's something positive to report, right? Next slide, please. So a little bit more as we build context and think about the data. So the numbers you see on the slide, these are absolutely staggering. So pre-pandemic, we were at roughly 8 million students who were chronically absent, and that doubled to 16 million students in the 2021-22 school year. It is an enormous number of kids. It's so urgent that we employ these tried and true family engagement principles in order to get our kids back to school. Next slide, please. So this next graphic really illustrates for us the diverging pathways when we think about attendance versus absenteeism. So these numbers make it so urgent because the research and data tell us just how much attendance matters. 16 million kids in this country are not learning on a regular basis, which has lifelong implications. So chronic absence highly correlates with students falling off the path toward academic success. Chronic absence in kindergarten and first grade can lead to the inability to read on grade level by the end of 3rd grade. Therefore, the inability to read on grade level by 3rd grade leads to lower academic achievement in middle school. And then students who aren't reading on grade level are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. So we can also flip this though and look at it from the positive lens of if a student is attending regularly. So students who do attend regularly in those early grades perform much better on measures of not only academic, but social and emotional capacities. Those kids who are attending regularly are much more likely to be able to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. And students who attend regularly are much more likely to have passing grades in middle school, and then are more likely to graduate from high school and to persist in college and graduate. The point of all of this data is that while showing up does not guarantee learning, a student who misses class simply cannot benefit. So if a large number of students are missing class in your school or in your district, it's really an indication of challenges that require systemic solutions. So thinking big picture. Next slide, please. One piece we wanted to mention is that chronic absence can often go unnoticed because schools are sometimes counting how many students show up every day rather than examining how many and which students are missing so much school that they're falling behind. So we call this average daily attendance. And really what it can do is it can mask these chronic absence numbers. So we're very used to thinking that, oh, 90%, 95%, that's a great grade. Yay, that's an A. But when it comes to attendance, even schools with a 90% or above for average daily attendance can still have high levels of chronic absence. So for example, if you look at school B in this graph, you can see that it has over 93% of average daily attendance, which sounds great, but it also has 18% of chronic absenteeism. So that's when you need to dig into the data and say, okay, who are these kids? Who is chronically absent? What's happening? How can we help each of these individual students? Next slide, please. This next graph really illustrates something pretty remarkable. So the state legislation in Connecticut requires that when a district has chronic absenteeism at a rate that's determined to be 10% or higher, then the district has to establish a district-wide attendance review team. And similarly, when a school in a district has a chronic absenteeism rate of 15% or higher, then the school has to establish an attendance review team. You can see from this visual the vast increase from pre-pandemic in 2018. Only 29% of schools in 2018 in Connecticut had to have an attendance team. Post-pandemic in 2022, we're at 87% of school districts are required to have an attendance team. So you can see that this is really almost everybody at this point, right? So when we're thinking of numbers that are just under 90%, we're talking about this is a widespread universal problem in Connecticut that we are, that's why we're here. We're all trying to work together to make these numbers better. Next slide, please. So Kari actually started off with this graph for you all, which is the most recent data from the state year to date through May 2023. The one piece that I want to highlight that I don't think is a repeat of what she mentioned earlier is that she noted that all of these different subgroups have shown improvement when we think about chronic absenteeism compared to that sort of peak year of the orange 21-22 compared to the most recent school year of 22-23 and that light blue on the right. But I want to draw your attention to that third from the left chunk, the students without high needs. So this is really the only group that we are struggling to see come down in the same way that these other subgroups have. So we can speculate as to why students without high needs may still be, those numbers aren't budging. In fact, it went up a tiny bit. But there, we're conducting focus groups thinking about why that is. We have theories and hypotheses and all sorts of things, but it is just interesting to note that those students without high needs are not actually coming down in terms of chronic absenteeism. Kari, did you want to say anything before I move to my next slide?
It's interesting that you said that. It's a really great point. But as I've looked at the monthly data for all of these groups, trend, we have seen the students without high needs, they had been going in the wrong direction. And over the last couple of months, they've been going back. And so they're starting to align with where they were last year, but they're still concerning that it hasn't come back down to closer to pre-pandemic levels. So it's something that we are watching. Thank you, Caroline.
Yeah, no worries. All right, next slide, please. So as I wrap up this section, thinking about building context, really beyond the statistics, beyond all of that data, attendance and engagement are more often than not at the heart of all other school leadership big picture thinking and initiatives. So we can think of attendance and engagement as the umbrella under which so many intertwined priorities fall. Next slide, please. And I love this graphic because it really just brings that to life. So as we think about attendance and engagement, let's view it as the intersection of everything we do. We can't dig into attendance and engagement without thinking about the root causes of absenteeism and disengagement. If kids feel like they are included and that they belong and that their school is a self-welcoming, safe space, and if school communities meet kids where they are, and if leadership makes that explicit choice to lead through an equity lens, keeping inclusion front and center by creating policies in a climate that are culturally responsive and cultivating a diverse, passionate, dynamic teacher workforce trained in culturally sustaining pedagogy, then our students and their families will be much more likely to be engaged, to be present, to be successful. And these are hard things to accomplish. I'm not saying that these are easy checkboxes by any stretch of the imagination, but we have to consider all of those pieces when we think about attendance engagement as the heart of all of these different priorities. Next slide, please. All right, why don't we pause for a moment? I do have Q&A built into the end of this session, but I'd love for this to just feel fairly informal, and folks are welcome to pop any questions into the chat as we're in between sections of the agenda. Or feel free to unmute, raise your hand, whatever's easiest for you. And I know my co-facilitators and hosts here will help me scan the crowd for questions and see if there's anything coming up in the chat.
Absolutely, Caroline. So far, we don't have anything, but please feel free, anyone.
Seeing other names here. Hi, Kenneth. Thanks for joining. Hi, Sarah Duso from Norwich. Nice to see you. All right. Well, why don't we keep rolling, and feel free to add anything in as you're thinking of it. So let's move into this next section, thinking about creating positive conditions for learning. Next slide, please. So when we think about positive conditions of learning, really this is what's going to make it much more likely that students will be willing to show up to school. And those conditions include cultural responsiveness, inclusivity, creating a sense of belonging for our students. Let's look a little more closely at what that looks like. Next slide, please. This is another graphic from Attendance Works. And if you wouldn't mind just hitting, I think it's 4 times, then all the little details in this graphic will show up. There we go. So positive conditions for learning lead to students being engaged, to attending regularly. Absenteeism, therefore, is a sign that one or more of these positive conditions for learning are missing. So as this graphic notes, relationships are essential. They are at the very center of this. Also note that these 4 conditions for learning overlap. Everything is interconnected. We can't have a healthy school community without all 4 of these pieces really being in place. So attendance is higher when schools are organized to promote students' physical and emotional health and safety. This is where we're thinking about a healthy learning environment, a welcoming, safe school climate, having access to food and other basic needs, thinking about things like restorative circles. Attendance is higher when schools are promoting that sense of belonging, connection, and support. So this is where we're thinking about, okay, do we have active student and family engagement? Do we have advisories and meetings that are happening to build community? Do we have enrichment opportunities, clubs, meeting all sorts of student interests? Do we have positive peer connections? Attendance is higher when schools make learning challenging and engaging so that students don't want to miss class. Do they have access to tech and the internet? Do we have learning supports in place? Are there opportunities for things like project-based learning, credit recovery opportunities when we think about the secondary level? Are there internships or community service? Do we have alternative scheduling options for students who may not be able to attend on a typical schedule? And lastly, attendance is higher when schools are supporting not only student well-being, but also the well-being of the adults in the building when we're thinking about that emotional competence. So are there restorative check-ins in place? Does everybody have access to health care and those mental health supports? Are we using trauma-informed practices? Does the staff have an opportunity for self-care? You know, when we think about post-pandemic teacher burnout and what is on the plate that is always overflowing, right? Staff self-care is a huge piece to this puzzle so that we have a healthy school climate and environment where students want to be there. Next slide, please. So I have a video excerpt I'd like to show you, but before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about this educator and expert, Baruti Kafele. And we really can't talk about positive conditions for learning and do it justice without talking about equity. So Principal Baruti Kafele is known for his equity-focused work. He actually spoke last fall at the RESC Alliance Igniting for Change conference. I don't know if anybody else was there, but he did an amazing job. He's a tremendous and inspirational speaker. So when he started teaching in the late 1980s, there really wasn't a name for what we now call equity education. He was just really determined to advocate for his mostly Black students and to honor their individual differences, practices that he later homed in on as an influential school turnaround principal in New Jersey. So these days, equity has really become a common buzzword, right, in K-12 education, but often this lacks depth and personal commitment in practice. So Kefele defines equity as meeting students where they are as they are, adding that the last part can be a particular challenge for teachers who have preset notions about what good students should be like and what their own role is in serving students. So in this sense, he says it's critical for educators to go beyond doing or implementing equity, now routine practice in many schools, but instead to being equity. He explains that being equity requires constant self-reflection and internal examination of how one interacts with students, how you're seeking to meet their learning and social needs as they are. Ultimately, he says that equity is a reflection of an educator's humanity toward the student he or she serves. And I love that quote. I think it really brings it home. He stresses that being equity requires developing an equity mindset, which he defines really closely as an equity mindset teacher is a teacher who utilizes a variety of appropriate instructional strategies that consider the differing academic, social, and emotional needs of each of the learners in a student-centered, culturally responsive, culturally relevant, barrier-free equity mindset classroom. This is where student individuality, student cultural identity, and student voice matter exponentially. So when he thinks about all of this bucket of work, he says that that definition can really be broken down into three essential components that he looks for when he's evaluating equity in a classroom or in a school. So we're going to take a look at an excerpt of a keynote where he identifies these three non-negotiables of equity. As you all watch, what I'd love you to do is to think about how these three non-negotiables really intersect with attendance and engagement. So Christine, if you wouldn't mind playing the video, that would be great.
Absolutely. Just give me 1 minute. I might have to switch screens.
And as you watch, also feel free to drop any reactions or any thinking into the chat.
Okay, just let me know and make sure that you can hear it.
I say equity has these three non-negotiables. I mean, I just can't negotiate this. I say, number one, equity, student individuality. Man, that's where the each comes from. You and I can't talk equity if we're not talking individuality of young people. We can't do it. Because within my individuality, we're talking about my very specific academic needs, my very specific social needs, my very specific emotional needs. But we're also talking about my own experiential background and its implications for my learning success in a classroom. We're talking about my reality. We're talking about my goals, my aspirations, my experiences, my obstacles, my challenges, my needs and interests. As I said, we're talking about the way I learn, the way I think, the way I process information, the way I make sense out of information. We don't all learn alike. So is it easy? No. But the opposite would be an equality mindset and an equality approach. So if I treat everybody the same, such as what speakers typically do in a keynote address, that won't fly in a classroom learning environment, because you got so much specificity, so much individuality in that room. So individuality matters, but it asks the question, am I visible in my classroom or am I invisible? Second, student cultural identity. So when we talk about young people in a classroom, there's no way in the world that we can deny nor suppress their cultural identity, which is inclusive of their racial, ethnic identity. That can't be suppressed. That can't be denied, so that a teacher or a leader or a counselor or whomever could feel comfortable. That has to be accentuated. And number 3, my non-negotiables, student voice. With my non-negotiable of student voice under the umbrella of equity, I'm saying to you, all of them have to have a voice, the ability to express themselves, whatever that may be. Is that vehicle there? That my voice matters, that I can articulate my thoughts, my views, my opinion, my ideas, my vantage point, my perspective. Can I do that in the classroom, or because it's not like everyone else, it's denied or it's suppressed? Do I have a voice? Because if I don't have a voice, if my voice is not appreciated and respected, then neither am I.
Are your kids in grades 6 to 11? Harvard has made SAT and ACT score submission optional in its admissions process. If they don't require SAT and ACT scores, how will Harvard and
Well, at this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker.
There we go. Thank you, Christine. I think you're on mute.
Okay, I think, are we all set with that, Caroline?
We are. That was perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. You're very welcome. I'll share the screen. Just give me one moment.
So I just love that clip because I think it really powerfully articulates exactly what we need to be thinking about when it comes to our students and equity. And I posed prior to the video, just thinking about how that intersects with attendance and engagement. And really, it comes back to it being the heart of it, right? If we're not thinking about students as individuals, inclusive of cultural identity, their voice, et cetera, all of those pieces are so incredibly important to the work that we do when it comes to attendance and engagement. Next slide, please. So I was recently presenting to a room full of superintendents about the challenges of increasing educator diversity in the state. And I posed this checklist to them. And I jokingly called it the hardest checklist in the world. But it really is so critically important, because when district and building leadership is prioritizing these pieces that you see on the screen, the result is much more likely to be a district where positive conditions for learning are in place. These are the interconnected pieces that are key. Attendance and absence are results of this entire puzzle. So when we think about the landscape of what is contributing to absenteeism or not, I challenge educational leaders to think about these big picture interconnected priorities that affect literally all elements of a school community. It all trickles down and impacts the culture and the climate of a district, of a school, of a classroom, and critically impacts attendance and engagement. Next slide, please. So this brings us to our last section about identifying and implementing interventions via a multi-tiered system of supports, or MTSS. Next slide, please. So thank you again to Attendance Works. This is one of their slides that I think really is very helpful. When we think about the wide variety of different reasons for attendance, reasons for absence, we can think of them as 4 different buckets. So barriers, aversion, disengagement, and misconceptions. So when we think about something like a chronic or an acute illness, that would fall under the barrier category. If we have a student who's struggling academically or maybe behaviorally, this might cause an aversion to school, right? When we think about a lack of challenging, culturally responsive instruction, that can lead to disengagement. And then when we think about misconceptions, it might be something like, oh, well, parents thinking or families thinking, oh, absences are really only a problem if they're unexcused, right? But if it's an excused absence, that's okay. So trying to shift that misconception, that's another one of those buckets. Next slide, please. So really the key point here is that teams in your building need to make sure that you are aligning the intervention to the reason for absence. It's really important that when we tackle attendance that we make sure we're matching the appropriate intervention to the reason for absence. So this requires understanding why absences are occurring. We can't speculate and guess as to why a child is absent. We need to be communicating with students and families to understand what is going on. So that school-home relationship is absolutely critical to making progress in getting kids back to school regularly. Next slide, please. So when we think about this multi-tiered system of support, we have tiers 1, 2, and 3. And if we go to the next slide, you can see a graphic that really helps illustrate this. So in order to provide equitable access to education, schools and districts need to put in place a tiered system of supports for students and families. So we use attendance data to inform a multi-tiered system of support to improve attendance. So when we look at the very bottom of our pyramid here, this is where we see those foundational supports. The pyramid graphic is showing how the 3 tiers of intervention sit on top of those foundational supports. These are what are promoting the positive conditions for learning. So when you look at tier 1, this is where we're thinking about universal preventions. These are for all students, for all families, and we're trying to encourage good attendance for all students. When we move up to tier 2 or early interventions, these are for students who need more support to avoid chronic absence. We're thinking about the kids now who are missing 10 to 19%. When we move up to the very top of the pyramid at tier 3, now we're thinking about the most intensive interventions for students who are facing the greatest challenges for getting to school. So these are the kids who are missing 20% or more. What really we want to keep in mind, though, is that these tiers are additive. So a student who needs tier 3 support still needs tier 1 and tier 2 and the foundational supports. Traditionally, schools tend to put the most energy into tier 3 supports rather than prevention or early intervention. And it's really much more effective to be proactive rather than reactive. So we want you thinking about how can you bolster those foundational supports? How can you bolster your tier 1 and tier 2 interventions so that we're not spending as much time and money, our critical finite resources, really on the tier 3. Kari, do you want to add anything to that piece?
No, I think I'm good. I really think a lot of the districts I've met with, many of them this last week or two, really need to focus on their foundational supports, making sure everyone's friendly in their schools, everyone feels welcome. Kids have a feeling that they're going to miss something if they're not in school. So looking at foundational supports in tier 1, I think we've really strengthened tier 2 supports since the pandemic started, but we really need to work on tier 1 and foundational supports.
Thank you. All right, next slide, please. So when we think about those tier 1 supports, this is a list that is not designed to be all encompassing, but we're thinking about those strategies that support good attendance for all students. So together with the foundational supports, tier 1 promotes attendance and engagement and prevents absenteeism. We want you to note, though, that this list doesn't include good practices such as taking attendance accurately every day or monitoring trends in attendance data. These strategies are actions that are taken to improve attendance or reduce absenteeism. Next slide, please. So tier 2, again, these are for students really missing 10% or more of school when we think about these tier 2 interventions. So we're thinking about working as a community to identify those patterns and barriers so that they can be addressed. Thinking about individualized student success plans that include attention to attendance. This is where we can add strategies to an IEP. This is where LEAP would be a good example of a tier 2 intervention. Thinking about family visits. Mentorship is a great one for tier 2. Those kids who need the check-in and check-out systems at the beginning or end of the day, or both, with a caring adult in the building, often that's built into an IEP. You have a special education teacher, especially at the elementary level, doing check-in, check-out. These are all examples of tier 2 to help remove barriers to attendance and to really layer in those supports. Next slide, please. So the last tier 3, is really those intensive interventions. So this is where students are missing more than 20% of the school year, or they're not responding to tier 2 interventions. This is when we consider adding those tier 3 interventions. So a lot of these are sort of the scary ones, right, that we think of when it comes to court and things that are really a last resort. But what we like to draw attention to are the things like educational support champions, finding an advocate for a child and a family who is really that point person, thinking about, are there organizational systems in place for those interagency cases so that things are being managed and streamlined? Those are pieces that are really very effective when it comes to Tier 3 interventions. Next slide, please. So I want to leave you with this resource page and really highlight the what is essentially the state's handbook of attendance and engagement 101. So it's the Reducing Chronic Absence in Connecticut Schools, a prevention and intervention guide for schools and districts. This is a superb resource. It has so much information that's really, truly very valuable in it. But that's your basics, that's your handbook. So if you have folks on your team who are really new to this work, or if you just need a refresher, we would like to point you in that direction because it is extremely helpful. In the last couple minutes that we have, we just want to open this up to questions from you. So feel free to pop anything into the chat or to unmute, raise your hand, and I will rely on my co-facilitators to help see who might have questions.
One other thing is we will stay on for a few minutes after this session and turn the recording off as well. So if you want to stay, if you have a burning question, please stay, and we'll have sort of after hours.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kari.
I don't know if people noticed in the chat that I say this often, that, you know, school attendance teams and district spend a lot of time on Tier 3 and those individual students who have just not come to school. And sometimes that can consume all of the time for a team. So be very careful about that. I like to say the more time you spend on Tier 3, the more Tier 3 situations you're going to have with your students. So because you're not taking care of Tier 1 and Tier 2. So make sure those tiers are also getting attention. Sometimes the Tier 3 students, districts, schools can't do it all. So schools may need assistance from outside agencies to help with those. And I invite everyone also to share this with your staff, any new administrators, any new staff. This video is designed to support people who haven't really done a lot of work on chronic absence.
And while we're waiting for people to think of their responses or questions, if you can use the chat box right now, we're going to go back to our first question when we started off. But you know, what level of expertise you feel you have in terms of attendance and engagement. So thinking as we went through these slides and kind of had some more information to layer to our knowledge base. What I'd like you to do is, if you don't mind, put your number in that you first had in the beginning. So say it was a 3, and then maybe you feel more at a 2 right now. And if you just put in the chat so it looks like this, that way we could just understand and get some feedback to how to support you more. The other thing, if you could add to the chat, is if there's any topics while we're going through these pieces that you would like a little bit more information about, please also feel free to add that to the chat for a deeper dive, because as we prepare for our next sessions and Talk Tuesday for next school year, we want to support you more. So say it is equity that you would like more information on, then just add that piece to the chat, or say it's just Tier 1. Okay, while people are doing that, I think
there's a question from Rachel. It is year to date, so it is cumulative throughout the whole year. So your chronic absence in May may be close to what they're going to be in June. They're not just your May data. I hope that answers your question, Rachel. It's nice to see you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
It's nice to see you. Our next, go ahead, Christine.
Sure. Yeah. No. So we also have, and I'll include this link not only in the chat box for you, but also the follow-up email, and you'll see it more and more. We're really looking for a survey of Talk Tuesday, especially last school year, that you've attended, and some feedback from it, because again, we're trying to really plan out our next sessions. So there is a Google form that I did create, and we'll gather the feedback that way. But again, I'll share it out. I was having my own issues with the links, so you might have to copy and paste them in a separate browser tab in order to open them up. But I'll also send the slide deck out and the link separately in the body of the email. And we do have our summer series coming. Our next 2 sessions are August 8th and August 22nd, if you want to add it to your calendar. Also, Holly, thank you for reminding me that we do the email, the reminder email does come out reminding us of the Zoom link and the session coming, but sometimes we notice it does go to those junk and those spam folders. Please check those. We did have a lot of people that were having trouble finding it. If you're still having issues, please let us know so we can support you more. But once you register for the summer series, one time, you have all 3 sessions access to. And again, here is our emails. If you have any questions or feedback, please let us know. Thank you all for joining us today. This was great. Thank you, Caroline.
Christine, there was one more question from Liz. She asked, are you sharing the link to the presentation? She joined a few minutes late.
Let me put it in the chat right now. I did, but I will add it one more time as a PDF. And I will be doing the follow-up email as well, so we'll have that.
And as Kari mentioned, if anyone wants to hang back on the Zoom, we can stay on and answer any questions with the recording off. Thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.